Hello everybody, welcome to Chapter 9, the Judiciary, the Law and Politics. So as we move into this chapter, we really want to think about the structure of the courts and what gives the power to certain courts. These are, as we go through these slides, see the different dimensions of the law, all grounded by our Constitution. So as you're reading through these chapters, try to make sense of some of the key concepts and some of the key acts that give them and create these powers, such as the Judiciary Act of 1789 that establishes the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land. As we look at this chart here, and the U.S. Supreme Court, which the 9 Supreme Court justices who have the power to interpret any law at any level in the country, what determine its constitutionality or unconstitutionality, and therefore setting the template of, setting the ground for any understanding of any law, and setting precedent, which is what our rule of law consists of. And as we move through, what are the different levels of the courts? But what I want us to focus on this concept of judicial review. How does the Supreme Court have all the powers that I just mentioned? The power to be able to interpret any law at any level in the land. And where does it come from? So we hear a lot in the news, and I sent you just a recent story on labor unions this week being determined, their fate being determined in the Supreme Court this week. Well, how did the Supreme Court develop that power? Well, we go to 1803, and in the case of Marbury v. Madison, which you're reading about in this chapter, this is where Chief Justice John Marshall, who was the very powerful Supreme Court Chief Justice from 1801 to 1835, so for 34 years he shaped the direction of the court. And his biography, his beliefs as a Federalist, believing that the government should have a strong centralized form of power, he issued many decrees. Let's go into that. But the most important Supreme Court ruling has to be found in Marbury v. Madison, 1803, because this is where the Supreme Court took the power to itself to review any law in the land. Therefore, this concept of judicial review emanates from that ruling, and this is why we see the Supreme Court doing what they're doing. So now, what types of powers and limits to that? What types of, how do the justices interpret the law? Do they interpret the law all objectively? No. This is the simple answer, but it's much more complex than that. And these are the different concepts that you're reading about on how political scientists encapsulate how these justices view and how they act on interpreting the law. And one reading that divides Supreme Court justices is this idea of original intent. Try to interpret the Constitution in the ways that the framers intended it to be, versus the majority of Supreme Court justices believing it is a living, breathing document, or a living constitution, therefore must be interpreted in the context of the time. So we can look at any debates that are ongoing in our contemporary society and say, well, this makes sense, but others would maybe believe that, no, we have to stick to that original constitutionalist approach. And those are the debates there. And one issue that is raging now, has been raging for a long time, been the issue of guns. The original interpretation of the Second Amendment, or should we reinterpret it with the growth in population and all the issues that are attributed to the manufacturing of the weapons and the availability? So how did the judicial powers really set the ground for civil rights? So Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, we really grounding their arguments on the 14th Amendment, that allowed for the desegregation of public education. But as we move to it overturned a precedent in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, which established the separate but equal doctrine. And as long as segregation is fine, separation in public facilities is okay, as long as they are equal. That was the theory, but in practice, our history was much different than that, separate but equal. And we know now, just a report around 60 years after Brown v. Board, came out in 2014, 2015, shows that public education is more segregated now in the United States than it was prior to 1954. So where is that march towards civil rights? And as we're thinking nomination, how do justices get nominated? We know it's on the presidency. We know this is why just in this last election, many people even found maybe not aligned with the president, but they knew that the power to nominate the judge and really force the court in a certain ideological direction was imperative, and that is just that. Whoever holds the power of the presidency holds the power of the Supreme to nominate the Supreme Court justices. And then they are confirmed by the Senate. And how diverse are these justices? Well, as you see, not very, right? But this is slowly changing. At the federal courts, you have some diversity. And these are the different decision-making procedures. And you're reading through how this happens. But I just wanted to highlight a few of the key aspects of this chapter as we move through this to make sense how it applies to our current predicament that we're in, our current society. And that's where we make sense of these, these legal doctrines when we apply them to where do we see them in today's society and how does it matter. So thank you. See you soon.